All right, welcome to our first insider threat, or our first lunch and learn. My name's Sam White. I'm a senior product manager for Defend at GitLab. And today I'm going to be talking about insider threat. Just for a little bit of background, in my previous role, I spent the last roughly 4.5 years working on insider threat products at a previous company. And so that really is where my background comes into play around what the insider threat is and how we're able to solve for it. So just at a high level, the agenda that I have planned for today is first to talk about recognizing the insider threat problem. Second, how do we categorize it? Third, we'll just be going over how to go about addressing the insider threat. And then lastly, anytime we talk about insider threat, there's almost always the implication of some kind of user activity monitoring, which then brings up privacy concerns. So we'll be addressing those last, and as well as other considerations when dealing with the insider threat or running an insider threat program. Also, just before we dive in, I just wanted to clarify the purpose of these lunch and learns. It's really, the purpose is just to share security-specific knowledge that we may have that may help our overall security understanding. So the agenda going forward, these are going to be held once every other month or more or less often as we have interest and individuals who want to present. But the idea is just to create a forum where we can share that knowledge amongst ourselves. So just to start off, a huge part of insider threat is trust. When we think about trust in our daily lives, we think of those around us that we trust. We think perhaps of people we don't trust, or people who have violated that trust in the past. Trust is really an important characteristic for companies to develop with their employees. Not only does trust keep us safe, but it enables our work and it allows us to work more efficiently. Without trust, it's really, really hard to get anything done. The downside to that trust is that trust can be betrayed. And although that's the exception rather than the rule, the fact remains that sometimes good people do bad things, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident, and mistakes happen. So at the end of the day, there is bad out there, and we can't just implicitly trust everyone no matter what. Typically, when I've talked with companies about the insider threat, the response that I hear tends to sound something like my 1-year-old son when we try to feed him some food that he doesn't like. And he covers his eyes. It's really funny. He purses his lips and he starts rubbing his eyes because he just doesn't want to see the food. He figures, hey, if I can't see it, if I cover my eyes, it won't exist and it'll just go away. And that's actually very similar in response to what I hear commonly from executive officers who say, well, I put all my employees through a background check. And, we have a small company, we all know each other and we all trust each other. And no one at my company would do something like that. And these are all, sort of paraphrase statements that I've heard in the course of my career where individuals, or especially executives, just have this implicit trust for their employees. And again, 99% of the time, if not more, that's a really good thing. It enables them to work fast and enables them to be efficient and get a lot done. Unfortunately, the reality is that trust tends to be abused in one way or another. So I've got 5 stories here, that range from, recent to a number of years ago, but all of them in one way or another can be traced back to the insider threat problem at the origin. If we go back to 2013, there was the Target breach. It was fairly prominent in the news. Essentially, an attacker managed to get the credentials of a Target contractor, basically one of Target's subcontractors, through a phishing campaign. They then took those credentials and logged onto the Target vendor portal. Once they were able to log on there, they found some vulnerable servers that they were able to exploit, which then got them access into the Target internal network. From there, they continued to spread laterally until they got access to their target's point-of-sale systems, where they planted malware, and in the end, they stole over 11 gigabytes of data and 110 million credit and debit card numbers. There were kind of a few initial breaches, Target, Home Depot, a few others that happened in that 2012, 2013 dates that really started to get the media's attention and started to raise awareness for the security risks that can happen at the corporate level. And this was a notable one. You might say, well, this was an external attacker. How is this an insider threat? At the end of the day, they were still able to take that individual's credentials and abuse those to get access. And so even though it wasn't the subcontractor themselves who was malicious, it was their susceptibility to that phishing campaign that ultimately led to that attacker being able to compromise the point of sale systems across Target. Another story, Citibank. This was in 2016. An IT worker had recently received a bad performance review and was, just generally frustrated with management. The worker sent a few emails to his colleagues expressing his frustrations, and other than that, there weren't a whole lot of forewarning signs. In the end, that employee decided to stay. Basically, that employee decided that it was over and they were going to be terminated one way or another, and they may as well go out with a bang. Whether or not that was true or not, I don't know that the facts are super clear in that matter. They were not terminated at that point, but they decided to stay after work, and they stayed after hours. That individual had access to all 10 of the company's central routers that govern the financial transactions, not only for all of Citibank, but in one way, shape, or form affected all of the transactions across the United States. That individual executed a script which was then sent to all 10 of those routers. Fortunately, that script was not able to execute on one of the routers, but it did execute successfully on the other 9. And so as a result, 90% of the banking activity across the entire US was taken down until they were able to restore those routers and repair the damage that script had done. Again, all that employee did was stayed after hours, executed a command, and then walked out the door and badged out for the day. Another story, and this one, the details are hidden about the exact company and individuals that were involved, but essentially a member of the security team themselves was cloning and running several virtual machines in an attempt to exfiltrate data. And the attack was rather complex. So this particular individual found that by cloning these virtual machines where the sensitive code was contained, one, they could start to get access to the data, but then they had the challenge of how do we get this out of the organization without triggering an alert or getting blocked by our data loss protection program. This insider found that they were able to print that information to an offline printer, which then generated a spool file. They could copy that spool file, send it over to a SIM server, which was a corporate server. It didn't have company DLP protections on it. So that was sort of a safe transfer inside of the organization by using the spool file as the file type. It was a file type that was whitelisted in their, or allow listed in their data loss protection system. So it also didn't show up when they transferred it to the SIM server. And from there, that individual uploaded the files just as blob storage to his personal Azure account. And this was a security individual. This was a security professional who was responsible for the security of the company, highly trusted individual in the organization that was exfiltrating this massive amount of data. Another story would be, ongoing suicide prevention. The federal government has come out, without sharing any details again or specifics, but has essentially said that they have seen example after example of programs, insider threat programs specifically, that have prevented suicides. Again, another angle of the insider threat. And then the last story is of a U.S. critical infrastructure company who, it was a developer who essentially outsourced his work to China. The company even had RSA token fob protection in place, but this individual decided to mail that RSA token to a developer in China who he paid for a fraction of his salary. And then he sat around watching cat videos all day. He actually got phenomenal performance reviews. He, was on track to get promoted, and he wasn't doing a single thing and exposing to the company to an incredible amount of risk by, for a project that should have been all US-based developers, outsourcing that development unbeknown to the company out to China. So again, a wide range of threats there. I just wanted to briefly share those 5 stories with you so you start to get a feel of some of the different types of insider threats that are out there and that actually occur in the real world. When we come down to categorizing the threat or thinking about it in a little bit more of a logical framework, I like to bucket it into these 5 buckets. And one of each of those stories fell into one of these 5 buckets. So the first one, probably the most common, is data exfiltration, where somebody is sending data that is proprietary information that shouldn't be shared and sending that data outside the company. That tends to be the use case that companies are the most concerned about. Others would be sabotage. That would be the example of the Citibank employee where we saw an intentional damage or destruction of company property. In that case, they wiped their routers. Fraud has a really broad range of things, anywhere from the story that I told you about the developer who outsourced his work to China, to embezzlement, insider trading, stock price manipulation, or even just stealing company time. Malware is another type of risk, which that could be either an individual installing malware directly on their machine, intentionally or unintentionally, or falling prey to a phishing campaign or some other, opening up some other vulnerability to the company that allows their credentials to become compromised, where an attacker is then able to abuse their account to harm the company. And then the last one is just, it's company liability. Anything that causes undue liability to the company, that would be illegal discrimination, harm to yourself or harm to others, anything that could potentially result in a lawsuit against the company. And both of these have both descriptive behaviors and prescriptive, where descriptive means that it's already happened, and behaviors that are backwards looking in time, indicative of an activity that has already taken place. And prescriptive behaviors are those that, they haven't necessarily done anything wrong yet, but they're precursors or common, early warning signs that somebody may be more likely to be an insider threat than somebody else. Another way to categorize this is malicious, accidental, and compromised. So it's important to take note that when we talk about insider threat, and the example that I referred to at the beginning of the CEO that just wants to cover their eyes and pretend it doesn't exist, oftentimes we gravitate towards the malicious. And when we hear insider threat, that's what we hear. We think of a malicious actor. The reality is that is the edge case far more than any of the other two. Most insider threats tend to fall in the accidental category, where there's no intention to harm, and really the individual just needs a little bit more training, or perhaps an additional security control needs to be put into place, or a compromised credential. So now that we've talked about categorizing it, let's talk about how we might go about building a solid program to actually address this insider threat and how we might go about protecting against this in the future. The model that I like to use is detect, identify, prioritize, investigate, respond, and prevent. This is actually useful not only for insider threat, but for other types of security workflows as well. But in general, I've seen this to be extremely efficient in describing a typical model that companies follow, whether they know it and describe it this way or whether they follow it unintentionally in order to protect against insider threats. So just to start off, we'll go through each of these 5 stages of an effective insider threat program. But the first one is to detect. So this really means collecting and gathering all of the data that you're able to get on individual users' activity. And there are 2 reasons for collecting all of that data. One is because you need to prioritize which individuals to look into and which events to investigate. And then 2, the second reason is you need to have data so that when you go do an investigation, you can have the necessary context to know what actually happens. And that includes data of both before and after the actual event that occurred. It's very common for companies to only take a look at data, from the time they actually see an inciting incident, from that point in time to start monitoring a user. However, the challenge is that you're missing 50% or more of the context of everything that happened up to that point. And then we talked before about prescriptive and descriptive behaviors. If you don't have all of those, precursors as part of your data point, it's very hard to understand the actual intent of what that person came out to do. So step 1, you need to collect all of the data, correlate it, associate it all back to an individual. Typically, all of these data points, have their own way of representing it, their own log formats, their own user IDs. So you have to deconflict that and align all of the data together. And then lastly, you need to store it and protect it. Typically, I recommend keeping data for at least 90 days. Investigative data ideally is kept even longer, 1 to 5 years, depending on your budget for storage. Collecting all of this data tends to add up really fast. And so one of the most expensive costs is storing all of that data. So there's kind of a trade-off there based off of what your budget is. But we'll come back to this more. Obviously, collecting all of this data is a huge treasure trove of information on an individual. And so implementing strict data security practices is key to avoid any potential spills of this data itself. So for the second step, identify and prioritize, this would be applying analytics or priority or finding a way to identify, to answer the question, what should I go and look at first? There are so many users in an organization and so many events and activity happening that it's impossible to have somebody actually sit down and physically monitor and review every activity of every person during every single day. It just is not scalable. So this is almost a whole nother presentation that I could go into more detail on, but I view 3 different types of models that are typically out there. The first is a behavioral model, and we talked about those different behaviors earlier on, both with predictive and descriptive types of models that might look for certain attributes or certain activities that either suggest a violation or look backwards and show that a violation occurred. I also like to think of things in terms of the U.S. Department of Justice model, which is, means, motive, and opportunity, to really understand what was the intent behind what they did. Means, motive, and opportunity by themselves does not actually prove anything. I can have the means to do something bad, I can have the motive to do something bad, and I can have an opportunity to do something bad, and I can still never act on it. But when you combine that justice model with the behavioral model, it gives an additional layer of context that helps you to understand, what were they doing? Why were they doing it? Was this actually out of malicious intent, or was this just something accidental? And then lastly would be an anomaly type model. And there are several in here. One is just pure volumetric anomalies. That would be something like, this user uploaded an unusually large number of files. Maybe today they uploaded 1,000 files, and on a normal day they only upload 10. So that would be a volumetric anomaly. There's also time series anomalies, meaning the sequence or order that you do things. For example, when I come into work every day, I tend to follow a rather set few set of steps every single day. Slack opens automatically. Typically, I open my email next. I open my calendar. Oftentimes, I'm joining a Zoom meeting. Those are very predictable, repeatable steps. And if I suddenly deviated from that and I started, my computer started up, and instead of opening my email, it just suddenly started running a whole bunch of commands or, reading and copying a whole bunch of files, that would almost certainly be an indicator that my credentials or my machine have been compromised and there's some piece of malware running on the machine. The third one there, unique association anomalies. So that would be thinking about the different entities that a user interacts with. For another example, take a look at email, right? I tend to email a fairly close set of contacts during the course of my workday, and I deviate out from that here and there. I may email, somebody in a different company. I may email somebody in a different department, but by and large, it's sort of a tight-knit association there. You might think of the same in terms of GitLab, like I tend to push and pull code from the same repositories every day. Every once in a while, I might go add a new repository or clone a new repository. That's the exception rather than the norm. And oftentimes it's a repository that somebody else in my department or my team or my organization is also looking at. If I were to just go out and hit an entirely new repository, that would be very unusual for me. Again, not necessarily indicative that I've done something bad, but it would increase the prioritization for me to go look at that activity and see, what was the context behind it. And then lastly, with all of these models, it's possible to compare your activity, not only compared to your historical personal behavior, but also your historical department's behavior, your peer group, and the organization as a whole. So typically, an effective organization will have some kind of analytics engine, whether that's a user and entity behavior analytics tool or UEBA tool, or just manual exploration through some kind of a business intelligence tool, or a combination of both is probably the most ideal. But they'll have some way of taking in all of this, mountain of data and prioritizing what needs to be reviewed first. The next step would be to investigate the data. And I know we talked about this a little bit before, but both, looking ahead of time and seeing what did they do leading up to that activity, and then after the fact, what did they do afterwards? Compiling all of this activity in sort of a timeline view helps to create that picture. In this example that I've got here, somebody stockpiles data, then they, here's the inciting incident, they exfiltrate that data, and then afterwards they cover their tracks. And lastly, if they open Facebook and send a Facebook message that says, I just sent you the data, please confirm receipt and send payment ASAP, that provides a huge amount of context around that person who emailed something, out of the company to their personal email address. Whereas, that very same inciting incident might take an entirely different color if they had just sent it to themselves to go work on from home and, actually never sent it to anyone else other than themselves. It just went to their own personal email address. Both actions put the company at some degree of risk. Obviously, the intent there would be very different, where one person may be just trying to increase their productivity or work on something from a personal machine, whereas the other case, somebody is actually actively selling the data for money. So really the intent of this investigate step is to stop the bad and free the good. And, it's important to note that the data you have to review here is entirely limited by the amount of data and your ability to clean and process that data that you've done back in that detect phase. So again, a key element, the foundational element really to any insider threat program is getting that good base of data to provide for that user activity monitoring. So next step would be to actually respond to the event. And there's a wide scale of different types of responses that you can take, ranging from doing nothing to actually prosecuting someone and pursuing civil and criminal charges against the person. I will note here that there are two schools of thought in the insider threat world, where one group of thought says, we want active response in place. We want to prevent as much as we possibly can, even if the user is notified. So they'll actively block certain actions. In that last example, they would have attempted to actually block that zip file from going out via email. The other school of thought is that we want to monitor only, but we never want to alert users to the degree that we're monitoring them or what our insider threat capabilities are. Because once an individual knows what's being blocked and what's not, there's almost always a way to find some sort of loophole or some way around the system. And so it's this thought that it's impossible to harden the exterior perimeter perfectly so that you can't ever have any data loss. And so it's actually better to just monitor the activity so as to avoid users from going down channels that loses visibility into what they're doing. So again, two schools of thought. I get the sense that the security community is pretty well divided between the two. So it really just depends on your philosophical approach and how you view the extent of an individual's ability to get around controls as to which option you would choose. And then the last step would be to prevent future activities. So, improving training for those accidental insider threats, refining your operating procedures, tuning rules in the technology itself. Here, as much as any of these steps, it's important to have harmony between the people, the process, and the technology. It's impossible to just buy one piece of software that's going to be your be-all, end-all and solve your insider threat problem. Similarly, in the people category, it's impossible to just train your users perfectly in a way that you're never going to have an insider threat or to have a flawless process that goes along with it. You really have to have all three working in harmony to be effective here. So lastly, to come back to the privacy topic, since that almost always is a topic that comes up when you start talking about monitoring and collecting, vast troves of data on user activity. There's no silver bullet here. Really what I have is a laundry list of different activities that can be done to respect individuals' privacy and to minimize, any concern there. First and foremost, it's important to identify your security requirements and start with those. If you don't need the data to help you prioritize or you don't need the data to help with an investigation, don't collect it. It's only going to fill up data space in your storage and unnecessarily invade on privacy. You always want to perform a legal review for any data that's collected, and that includes anytime you're going to go start collecting something new. Ideally, that goes through a legal review, especially with GDPR and the privacy laws vary from country to country. So if you're a global organization or if you even have users who are traveling globally, it's important to take all of that into consideration and make sure that you're being respectful of all of the laws that are in place. Auditing any activity that's done by an investigator and implementing what's commonly called a watch the watcher program, where you have an auditor who comes in and audits the investigators, and even the auditor themselves gets audited. So that way, you never have one person who has freedom to operate without somebody else coming in to double check their work and verify what they did. Good technology control is to require two people to authorize any changes that are made. Another precaution is, with regular expressions or other keyword lists, certain sites that individuals are visiting, you can attempt as best you can to filter out any sensitive data, any sensitive personal information that you don't actually want to collect that has nothing to do with protecting against the insider threat, and just, potentially increases your legal exposure for collecting the data. Establishing a clear data retention policy for when and where and how you delete data. Another approach is to use anonymization or pseudonymization to prevent bias, so that as you're going through and reviewing the data, there's no conscious or unconscious bias based off of the specific individual that you may be investigating. And then ideally, organizations have a strict process for unmasking that data, revealing who it is once they've confirmed that there's actually something legitimate. So that way there's no bias in place. And lastly, certainly not least, is to absolutely be uncompromising in securing the data storage for your insider threat product. It almost goes without saying that collecting all of this data would be an absolute treasure trove for any attacker or anybody with malicious intent. And so that has to be priority number one in the organization for protecting it. There are a few tools that can be done both procedurally and technology-wise to help with that. It's common for organizations who have a robust insider threat program to firewall off their insider threat data storage with a one-directional firewall so that the data can come in, but nothing comes out, and to put that whole storage off on its own isolated, almost sandbox network so that anyone who's reviewing that data is on that network. They have no access to the internet or anything else. And there's no way for that data to come back out, at least not through any open firewall port. So that helps to minimize your exposure. And then lastly, as noted above, but auditing absolutely everything that happens in regards to that data storage and making sure that you have separation of duties so that, again, no one person has the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, without being able to be audited in a way that they're not able to cover their tracks. Like most things in life, balance is desperately needed when you do an insider threat program. How far do you go to protect against the insider threat versus, respecting trust and freedom and privacy? It's a delicate balance. It's not, again, there's no silver bullet there, but it's a balance that's needed in both regards. And unfortunately, today it's too common to see organizations swing too far one way or too far the other way. And either way leaves, yourself either open to a lot of risk or, potentially in the state of stifling and over controlling your employees. So that's the end of my presentation. For those of you who may be watching virtually or asynchronously, I will check back in the notes document. If you want to leave your notes there, I'll check back in and attempt to address any questions that come in there asynchronously as well. You're also welcome to reach out directly to me. Seth, I know you've got one question in here. Do you want to vocalize that real quick?
Yeah, I'm curious, and I don't know whether this makes much of a difference, but certainly there's been a couple of cases now of insiders actually being spies or working for governments or not in control of their own actions. And I'm wondering if you think of that threat differently than someone that might be doing this based on their own motives.
So I tend to subscribe to the belief that, with rare exceptions, individuals are mostly able to control their own actions, and perhaps they were recruited as a spy, perhaps they voluntarily signed up, perhaps they were forced to, but by and large, I categorize those as in the malicious category where they're actually intentionally trying to do harm. It's always possible that the person is acting entirely against their will and they're being coerced. But at the end of the day, from a behavioral standpoint, their actions tend to look and feel almost identical to a malicious actor at that point, because they're, even if it's not them with their own intent to be malicious, it's the nation state that is backing them that has the intent to be malicious. And so, they tend to actively go out and, the things like the sabotage case that we talked about at Citibank, they tend to do similar types of activities where it's very deliberate, very intentional, regardless of perhaps, whatever personal beliefs that they may have that may have been concealed. Any other questions? Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Yeah, is there one more?
No, I just wanted to say it was a great talk. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for putting this together.